All right, welcome back to the Badger Den StrengthCast. This is episode number 6 already. It's kind of hard to believe we've made it this far.
Yeah. I mean, rocking them out.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with our consistency going through this.
It was shaky in the beginning, but I think we kind of hit
yeah,
the cycle, hit the routine, got over the technical difficulties pretty quickly, and got rolling.
Yeah. So when this one comes out, it's going to be just before starting a deload week at the gym. We figured it might be a good time to talk about, what is a deload? Why do we deload? What are the matters of fatigue that are behind the deload and these different ideas? It's not something we really talk about. We talk about it on the base program a little bit, but it's mostly just eventually you get stuck, and then we do this thing called a deload, and you're like, okay, it makes sense. We go down in weight, but
yeah, and I've had people be confused about the fact that we use deload for both phrases, because they are both deloads, but they mean very different things. We have a deload week, which is for everybody, kind of mostly people on percentages, where it's a full step back recovery period. Every weights are much lower. It's active recovery. And then there's a deload for people on the linear/base program, where it's a true kick backwards on their weights for refreshing their essentially progress. And we use deload for both, and they are both deloads, but a little bit different.
Yeah.
Just to clarify.
So deload more as a concept is essentially just giving yourself time to recover, essentially paraphrasing what you've already said, right? Because, physiologically we get to this point that we've accumulated so much stress, so much fatigue, that we're no longer able to make progress, and that fatigue is starting to mask our fitness levels, our ability to perform. So on the base level, just because of the nature of that first 6 to 12 months of working out, you're a lot more resilient ultimately. We haven't really gotten to limit level weights yet, that you don't need a huge deload on everything. You don't need this big systemic deload necessarily to continue to progress, right? And everybody's a little bit different, but most times when we get to these first or second deloads, you will still be able to move up on other lifts. Sometimes the one that gets weird is deadlift and squat, because there's such a carryover between the two that maybe if you're still squatting heavy, it's hard to continue forward even after having deloaded the deadlift, right? Just because, if your squat's high already too, then it's you don't ever get this big refresh like you ultimately do on the percentages. So having experienced the deloads on the base program, especially toward the end of the base program, it's not as refreshing ultimately, right?
Yeah, I think that they're geared for a very different purpose for the base program, and because we're always trying to squeeze as much of that initial adaptation out of people on the linear program, I feel like, in trying to maximize that weight for coming into the percentages, which is more a long-term program geared towards long-term growth and strength. And so when we're deloading it for the base, it's still going to feel hard, likely. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, you're doing heavy weights. You get to a point where you literally can't, and you still have room to grow. And so instead of just running into a weight that you haven't accomplished, we're going to take a half step back. It's kind of like going around the flood. It's just a little skirt and then back on the path. But that little skirt is enough to give you just that little bit of time to continue adaptation, that little bit of rest, which doesn't necessarily feel like rest for people who are doing it, because it's still heavy-ass weights.
Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't gotten to a deload yet, especially on the base program, well, obviously only on the base program, when we hit a deload, if we're looking at squats, for example, and when we're doing a lower body deload, it's going to be a 30-pound drop. So if you make it to 185 pounds on your squat, and you get a set of 5, a set of 4, a set of 3, we don't make all 3 sets of 5, then we're going to drop you 30 pounds because we've kind of hit that first wall, right? And, if we just keep beating our head against the wall, maybe we make a little bit of progress, but you're much better off just taking that 30-pound drop and then working one step forward step by step until you get back to that 185. We usually break through it in that first time through, and we may be making like 20, 30 pounds before you end up having to deload again. But when we start to get to like the actual limit weights, kind of like what you're talking about, like, you know, if you make it to 300 pounds on a squat for 3 sets of 5, you know, dropping 30 pounds is now only 10% versus, you know, when you were doing it at 185, it's a significant percent larger to drop 30 pounds.
Yeah.
Right?
You also just have like accumulated fatigue over time, which eventually catches up to you. But it does seem to kind of I wonder if it does always seem to coincide though with a good time, right? I would imagine that if you kind of like slowed down more in that base class, your fatigue would kind of catch up to you before you got maximal gains from that linear progression, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. You know what I'm trying to say? It always kind of seems like your cumulative fatigue, regardless of really time, because there's some people that are on the base class for a month, which is really short to be in a base class, but, you know, a very short period, I should say, not try to put a time period on it, but like a short period of time they're on the base class, they get everything they can out of it, and their cumulative fatigue does hit them, but they do make all the gains. And then there's some people that are on for a very long period of time, and they make similar gains, and that cumulative fatigue kind of catches up to them in the same way over a much longer period of time. And both of them made sort of equivalent gains, more or less, for themselves, you know, subjective. It's kind of funny that works out that way. I don't know. I'm just kind of wondering if there's something with the adaptation in early on that kind of keeps that fatigue at bay until you kind of hit like a certain point where, you know, it feels like you're trying, like what's the term, the stress to fatigue ratio when you're lifting. Like you feel like you're trying, but you're kind of not, because it's like early on, and it's not until later that you're truly hitting that threshold, and that's only then does the fatigue really start to kick up. And since that threshold is kind of individualistic and everybody finds it at a different point, you kind of start to accumulate that fatigue at different points, but it still tends to be at around where we want it to start happening in the base class. Did that ramble make sense?
Yeah, so maybe I can paraphrase a couple things and see if I'm picking up what you're putting down here. Now, that idea of fatigue, that's definitely part of it. And to your point of saying, like, you know, what feels hard early on isn't, like, actually hard yet. Mm-hmm. And, you know, maybe you're not accumulating as much fatigue as you might feel like you are initially. I think that point, like, when you're early on in your weightlifting journey, right, you're not able to as fully engage your muscles as you can once they're trained a little bit more. Mm-hmm. So, like, you know, if you know, like 100% output is like so much contraction that the muscle's actually going to snap off the bone, right? But, you know, your brain has these limiters, these brakes on it. Yeah. I think we may have talked about this.
I think we mentioned it in the last one a little bit.
So you've got these brakes in your system that stop you from actually doing like 100% output, because that level of output's actually going to tear the muscle off of the bones. It's not good for your body, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, maybe, and these are just ballpark numbers, they're not exact sciences or anything like that, but maybe when you're first starting, you can, like, utilize 60%, right, of your muscle's actual capabilities without your brain putting brakes on the system, right? Mm-hmm. But once you've trained for a little while, then maybe you can use 70. And then once you've trained for a little bit while longer, maybe you can start to use 80. And the fact that, like, you know, these aren't huge differences going from 60 to 80, but, like, also they kind of are when you're doing huge amounts of weight, right? So you're able to accumulate fatigue at a significantly faster rate once you are more intermediate, more advanced than someone who can at a beginner level. So when you're first coming in, you know, the workouts are hard, right? I don't want it to sound like you're not actually getting fatigued doing these workouts, but at like a deep physiological level, you actually have a lot of room to recover still, even after hard workouts, which is why, like, so many people can start into a weightlifting training program or like a CrossFit program and just slam their heads against the walls for a long time and be making great gains because they have all this wiggle room when they first start out, right? But the more advanced you get, the tighter these margins are for like what is actually good training for your body and what's actually going to progress you, right? So we have a lot more room to fuck around on the base program, right? We don't have to worry as much about caging fatigue, this big monster that like really does affect people at an intermediate level.
Yeah.
Why we see such a high burnout rate on people like doing this kind of thing like 2 years in, because all of a sudden they're not seeing gains anymore. And it's just this big point that's ultimately why we have two programs, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. You know?
Yeah, it's almost like when you're coming in starting off, and this is probably exactly what it is. You come out, you're just walking off the street into a gym. When you're first training, you're simultaneously training not only your muscles, but your nervous system too. And so you have this extra capacity to grow quickly without necessarily accumulating fatigue, because while you're simultaneously getting stronger muscular-wise, you're also getting better nervous system-wise.
Yeah.
And the utilization and even just like becoming more efficient with the lift itself. And so exactly, you have more room to kind of bang your head against the wall, and then eventually your nervous system kind of caps out where it can really keep growing at the pace. And once that happens, I wonder if the strength would slow down too, but I almost wonder if it just kind of like keeps growing at the same point, but like subjectively it feels like it's worse because you've kind of hit half your tools are gone now.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So to your point, like, you know, you're gaining huge amounts of weight on your lifts within those first several months. You know, I always tell people when they first come in, you know, we do this for 10 weeks. You're going to put 100 pounds on your squat. You're 100 pounds on your deadlift because we're going up 10 pounds per week when we're doing this. And you are really lucky to get 100 pounds in a year once you hit that intermediate level.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long to get there. You know, it takes that 6 to 12 months in the base program where you're getting these huge gains month over month. And then it's like, you know, at the end of every 16-week block, at the end of every 4 months when we do our 1 rep maxes, we're looking for like another 20 pounds if we're doing well. Right?
Yeah.
Which isn't a lot in the moment, but when you add those up over time, that's really where the gains start to come because it is significantly harder to continue to improve. And like you said about like, you know, your tools, you've utilized as much as you can out of like several of your tools by the time you hit the intermediate phase. And I think a lot of that's when you talk about nervous system, it's what's like motor learning, right? Ultimately, like your brain learning how to do these different patterns efficiently and do it well. So there's all these different layers, like not only muscular strength, like you're talking about, and like connective tissue strength, but like intramuscular and intramuscular coordination, like your muscle's ability to coordinate how it fires its motor units and like fire them more efficiently and more of them together at the same time. And then also like your muscle's ability to coordinate with other muscles and do things together in unison versus like being just a little bit sloppy a lot of times in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
So there's all these different layers when it comes to both like the muscular and the neural adaptations that come with this stuff.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that then that's kind of circling back to fatigue and recovery. I just had this thought when we were thinking about it, about how when people get to intermediate level when they get stuck. And I think that intermediate level is often the time when a lot of people, when they have the opportunity, are, you know, begin taking PEDs, probably much earlier than they should. Not to say should in the sense that like I would necessarily recommend ever using PEDs, but I think in certain sports, or if your end goal, depending on what your goals are, there might become a time when it would be beneficial for you goal-wise to take PEDs. But I think people start in that intermediate phase, they kind of preemptively start feeling themselves slow down and not doing as much, and then they're at a commercial gym with a bunch of other people, and somebody's got some juice, and it becomes available. And I think that that's actually probably a really common time when people begin taking something like PEDs. And I think PEDs are so effective not because they make you grow muscle more, which they do to some extent. I think largely where they come into the biggest beneficial effect is that they help you recover so much faster than you would normally. And so you can work less or more alternatively.
Yeah, it's a weird double-edged thing where you can do either of those things and continue to improve. Like you've got more room for junk volume. But for anybody who didn't catch on, PEDs, that's performance enhancing drugs. That's like what people are typically thinking of when they think of steroids, right?
Which in PEDs performance, they encompass this massive scope of a bunch of different things that can range from just simple like steroids to like EPO to like all sorts of fucking things. A lot of things. More things than I know. I can't. It's such a broad range.
And I don't want to get
things
off on too much of a tangent on PEDs and like this idea of steroids, but because it's such a taboo topic a lot of times, especially for people beginning, it's like steroids. I think they're becoming a lot less like villainized than they used to be, which I think is a good thing because
I think it's good.
Ultimately it's like, do whatever the fuck you want with your body, right?
Yeah.
But
safely.
Right, safely, which is also very hard to do unless you're being guided by like a high-level professional with that kind of stuff. And like, if anybody's listening to this and thinking about doing this and you're at our gym, you probably need some guidance on how to train maybe more effectively to get the results you want before you want to be thinking about doing PEDs, because a lot of times that's like more looks related for most people, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's like an important thing to. This is something I want to talk about later on in this episode.
Okay.
is about the general idea of like min-maxing and degrees of like return on investment. But just to kind of get a little bit here, it's just there's phases of your journey where different tools become more beneficial. And something like PEDs and steroids, I think, is a good tool based on your goals. And oftentimes those goals are for people who are like, I would never tell somebody not to use PEDs that is aspiring to become a world-class, like, strongman athlete.
Right.
And is, like, on the verge of stepping onto that world stage to the point where they're stepping into this world where PEDs are maybe not necessarily legal, but they're not tested for, and they're going to be competing against people that are absolute monsters that are all using them with doctors, and it would always be at that point. But if you're just trying to hit 4 plates, I'm not going to be like, use steroids, It's like there's levels to this thing, and I think even for like physical appearance wise, if you are really trying to compete in bodybuilding or you're trying to create a career out of your physique, then I would be much more apathetic and maybe even recommend looking at something like PEDs and steroids safely. If you just want your summer bod for the 3 months that you're going to be going to like the Lake Michigan beaches, I'm going to say no, that's probably not something that you should be looking at using.
Yeah, I mean, so like this is really only pertinent to a very small percentage of anybody who would be listening to this, right?
Yeah.
It's like for most general people, it's not even something that you'd even consider, right? Because it is mostly...
No, but I think it's one of those things it's like Coke. It's like way more common than a lot of people probably think. And for our gym, I hope that there's nobody backroom dealing, but you don't know. But for people that are in other gyms and cultures and spaces, I know that it's something that's super common, and it can kind of spread throughout a whole gym.
Yeah, I can think of a couple that are in town.
This is something that's maybe not applicable for people right now, but anybody who's listening that their journey might eventually take them away from Badger Den, or they came from somewhere else. It's something for them too.
Sure. And again, this isn't to say really anything about steroids because it's a very individual matter. And, what's right for somebody isn't going to be right for necessarily anybody else, right?
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing is, like, there shouldn't be a stigma around it like there is, right? I think that's ultimately all I wanted to say about it.
Yeah.
It's not something I've got hands-on experience with. It's something that, like, I've got a better understanding than your average Joe on.
Yeah.
But it like you said, ultimately it's got its place. And unfortunately for most lay people, one of the first places you realize that this is very much everywhere is social media.
Yeah.
Because, like, just about anybody that you follow on social media that's, like, lean year-round is on something.
Almost certainly. It's, like you said, something not to be stigmatized. It's more something to be understood.
Yes.
I wish there was more education for, like, the average person, because there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily on steroids that a lot of people think are because they don't understand steroids. Yep. And there's a lot of people simultaneously that are also on steroids that people just don't think are. And it's this weird, like, dichotomy that exists where you can have people out there being like, yeah, The Rock's natural. But then, like...
Sylvester Stallone at 70 or whatever.
Yeah. But then, like, you'll have somebody that's, like, totally reasonable that is, not on steroids. Or a common one is like Mike Isertel on RB Fitness. They did a review on whether or not Conor McGregor was on steroids, and I thought that was a good one. A lot of people think that Conor McGregor's on steroids because he is swole as fuck right now. Like, dude's massive. But per Mike Isertel, he says that he doesn't necessarily think that he is, and that the growth that Conor McGregor has shown over the last, like, 10 months or so seems to be pretty in line with somebody who got injured and could no longer train in certain ways, but then continued training in the ways that they could, which is largely, like, arms, upper body, things like that. And so they're gaining in a way where they're doing more hypertrophy training now versus before when they were probably doing heavy sparring and cardio. It was an interesting way to look at it. And here's a person that does have some, like, real hands-on knowledge and experience behind PEDs. They're very clear and transparent about how their PED use. And they don't think Conor McGregor's on steroids. And the zeitgeist right now is that he is. So.
Yeah, I mean, and, like, the flip side of that is there's plenty of people that just look like slightly above average Joes and, like, other commercial gyms that have been on steroids for a long time and don't actually get any use out of it, which is a crazy thing because it goes back to this idea that, like, steroids are magic and you just start popping steroids and all of a sudden you're going to be this huge dude. And that's not really what it is. Like you said, it's more about, like, your ability to recover from hard work.
Exactly.
And we did say, on one end of this coin, you can work less hard and still make gains. And that's true when we're considering advanced and elite athletes because they have this ability to push themselves very, very hard with very, very few sets, right?
Yeah, that's specifically, that's sort of what I was
just
thinking.
To close up that loophole.
Yeah, that's a good thing to loop.
But anyways, maybe back to fatigue. I don't know.
Fatigue, yeah. I mean, it's all connected. It's all a web.
But, like, okay, so, like, we left this idea of fatigue talking about the base class and why we deload.
And why we deload. Mm-hmm.
And if we think about it with the percentage-based group, we've kind of touched on it a lot already. It's really just that with the percentage-based group, they're able to push a lot of things a lot further, and they actually have probably a higher work capacity in general, so they can push it longer, but then everything is going to hit the fan all at once if you don't hit the brakes eventually. So when we're going along with this idea of, like, rating of perceived exertion or RPE, most new people coming into it should have an idea of what that is because they'll tell people coming into the gym, work at a 7 out of 10 when we're first figuring out our exercises. You can get a lot out of 7 out of 10, but you can't get a lot out of 7 out of 10 for a long time, right? Which is why a lot of our blocks will start like a 6 or 7 out of 10 as you start to figure out the exercises because you have a very low threshold on what's actually going to get you to advance.
Yeah.
And then the next week we bump it up a little bit. And then we bump it up a little bit, right? Until eventually we're getting to 9, we're getting to 10 RPE where you can't really go anywhere else. So once you've hit that maximal output, the only way to go is back, right?
Yeah.
So that's when we really hit the gas as hard as we fucking can for a week, get the most out of the movements that we can before we switch things, and then we give you a whole week to recover from it and come back stronger.
Mm-hmm. And I would point out that a lot of people that are kind of just starting out lifting, they have no idea what like 7, 8, 9, 10 RPE feels like. So that's why sometimes you can feel like you're at 10 and then you keep doing more weight every week for 5 weeks because you weren't really at 10.
Yes.
You just don't know what a 10 is.
Yes, 100%. And that happens all the time.
Yeah.
It's like, somebody will get to like 95 pounds and be like, I don't think I can lift any more than this. This is the heaviest thing I've ever done. I'm like, okay, well, next week it's 100.
Next week's a new
week.
And
they come back like, holy fuck, I did it, but I don't think I can do it again. I'm like,
we'll
I think
see.
you got one more and you did. Let's just keep going.
Well, I also, on the flip side of that, I always think it's funny when people are like, when does it get easy? And it's like, oh, sweet summer child. It doesn't.
I tell people all the time, it doesn't get easier. You just get better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Things, you do get the satisfaction in things being easy when you get to a certain point, and then you're like just kind of dicking around, or you're doing some warm-ups and you're doing a weight that used to be
a 1-rep max.
A 1-rep max. Like, I've fallen backwards doing 135 back squat before. So it's like, and now look at me. Look how far I've come.
You don't even look at 135.
I don't even look at it. I skip it.
But no, that's really true. I mean, the better you get, the harder I can push you ultimately, right? And for a lot of these things that we've already said.
And you should be, because you grow via adaptation, and you don't get adaptation without stress.
Gotta stress to progress.
Yep. And so if you are not doing challenging weights, it's never going to happen. This is also something that I talk to people about who constantly are like, and we keep getting tossed in the weeds, but I do want to talk about this because it's fresh on my mind. It's when people talk about this idea of like, I did it, but I didn't feel comfortable with the form. So I think I'm going to just do this for a couple weeks and then really dial in that form. And it's like, and I hear this commonly, I've heard it a couple times in our gym, and I've heard it from a ton of layman's people all the time. And there is just this like chart of like strength to skill where you will never reach optimal form without continuing to increase your strength. And you won't increase your strength without increasing weight. And if you focus on your form in a way that doesn't increase weight and therefore doesn't increase strength, you will never reach your form goals, and then you're just going to be fucking stuck forever. And I'm sorry to tell you, you're never going to get there to a degree. I want to say this with the asterisks.
Yeah, it's very much a beginner idea that you have to continue at a specific weight because it's starting to get a little bit hard and it's starting to not feel like you're doing it 100% perfect anymore because it's not easy anymore ultimately, right? And it's an understandable thing to think because that's how like probably a lot of other life things work, right?
Yeah.
But this is a different fucking ball game.
Yeah, it's a different animal,
There's a reason we start as low as we do on the weights, and it's because it gives you this opportunity to continue to work on technique for a very long time through that base program, even at the weights that are the highest weights they've ever been before, right? Because even these heaviest weights, they're a learning experience, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to your mentality going into these heavier weights, and it's hard when they are first getting heavy for the very first time in your life because they freak you out.
Yeah,
right.
Still freak me out.
Yeah, right. But it's your opportunity to like show up, right? You can let it freak you out, and you can just like cower under that weight and just hope you get through it, or you can show up and just do your fucking best and trust your spotter, right?
Yeah.
And if you can just show up and do your best, and maybe you don't make all 5 fucking reps, doesn't matter. If you can go through it and learn from that experience, learn how your body moves under these heaviest loads, and then come back with some things to work on, right? Then all of a sudden we have incredibly increased how quickly we're going to get better at this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're thinking about how our body learns from things, a lot of it comes from making mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? When we're thinking about how the cerebellum is actually going to build and work on motor programs, right? And how your body moves. And giving it these opportunities at these stressful situations is what's going to promote that growth significantly more quickly. Because it's like, oh, fuck, dude, I got to figure this out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the gym is incredible in that it's a safe place to hit these fails, right? You can't fail like this in many places in life, where it's this really safe opportunity to push as hard as you can fucking go and see what your mind can do, right? See what your body can come back from, right? Because, like, the chance of injury is so hilariously low most of the times.
As long as the right precautions are taken.
Right, you know, I mean, you can't go, like, well, the 99% of people can't go into the gym the first day and throw 300 pounds on and be like, okay, let's see what my body can do. And if I don't make it, well, I'm going to learn from it, right? You know,
if I die.
That's that's a little far. But with following the right path, you know, taking this journey, you have that opportunity.
And there's an acceptable, I think one thing to keep, there's an acceptable range of form within this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like when we label form, and you're not expected to keep perfect form all the way up to failure. Like,
that's a very, very advanced thing to do. Like, that's elite level stuff.
You're just gonna, like, for the average person, you're going to move within that, and the goal, your goal should be to keep within that range of avoiding injury primarily and still getting results, but as much results as you can. But you can't chase that peak form, otherwise you're gonna get stuck.
Yeah, I mean, you're always chasing that dragon of what is perfect, right? And no one can tell you. It's something that you have to learn on your own through experience and through challenging yourself. But man, there was something good I had to say and I lost it.
I think that there's just this we didn't mean to, but this does actually touch into fatigue and deload and, like, why we deload. And we've talked about so many things that are just like why it's important, the things that you need to do in order to keep progressing. And so many of these things deal with being able to show up and give good effort with good form and completing weights. And ultimately, when you're fatigued, you can't do any of those things. And that's really why we bake in and why you need recovery is so important, because you need to be able to accomplish the goals in order to make the gains. And you can't just Goggins everything. You know, it's not going to work. It's not real.
Don't tell people that. Don't lift the veil just yet.
I think that's it was really funny because I just was watching some video game streamers, and they were making jokes about, like, how long it would take somebody to get ripped, and one of them was like, like a few months, would, you know, and they were like, no, and the other one was like, really, yeah, how, a few months? And they're like, yeah, just like I mean, working out like 7 days a week, like 4 hours a day, and then it's like, and then the other one was like, when are you gonna sleep? And then they're like, never, just work out. And it was like, oh, so never have time to actually grow those muscles. And I was like, wow, somebody that has some inkling of an idea in that, where that growth takes place is not in the work, it's in the recovery.
Yeah, that's a really good point too that we don't usually touch on. And that, like, we have you for an hour at the gym, right? And ultimately, we're just giving you the stimulus, and you have to take that stimulus, and you have to grow it. You have to let it grow, right? I gave you the seed. Now you got to take it home. And you got to put it in your pot. And you got to put some soil on it, and you got to water it.
Let it go.
You know, you got to give it a comfy bed and feed it its protein, and then you get the big muscles,
and
right?
then you get the results.
Well, you don't have to get big muscles. That's
you get strong muscles, all the muscles. I think that is the key, is that for gaining strength and hypertrophy, whichever your goal is, it's ultimately damaging muscle tissue.
Yeah, I mean, especially hypertrophy, which is specifically growing muscle, right? And you don't necessarily have to do that for other adaptations. Like if we're looking better at getting better at something like agility or jumping ability or just like maximal strength output, things like that. That's not necessarily that it's got to come from muscle damage, but that's a big factor, and it's going to come along with all these other things too. So even if we're just doing like, this isn't something we do in our gym, but if you're just doing an agility program or just doing a plyometric program, that rest and recovery is the most important part, because there is no improved jump without the recovery, without the adaptation. Oh, so and to circle back a little bit, what we were talking about with form and like not being able to keep form at heavier weights when you're a beginner, that comes down to so many factors. A lot of it is, again, that idea of like muscular coordination, but it's also like our opportunity to see where our weak links are, because you're going to come in with so many different, you haven't been evened out yet.
Yeah.
Right? You're a big lumpy clump of dough, and I haven't been able to take out my rolling pin and get you all into one even distribution of thickness. Right?
Yeah. One solid log.
So, but the point being that like maybe you came in and your quads were already predominantly much stronger than your posterior chains, so we start to see that there's like this inability to sit into your hamstrings at the heavier weights, because all of a sudden your quads want to take over and do the work because that's where your body's comfortable. And maybe we didn't see that up until the point that you were starting to really be challenged at these heavier weights. So we would have never known to work on them to begin with, because we didn't get that clue from finding what those weak links are.
Yeah, or they themselves never felt the need to, because maybe they just, now they have a goal in mind of a weight, and up until this point they've been able to be fine with like a quad dominant squat.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they're like, well, how can I lift this anymore? And it's like, well,
we got to get that
we
ass
got to work on those cheeks.
Yeah. And like trunk stability is a huge one for beginners too. Like it's such a common first problem with things like squats, is that they just like don't have this trunk stability yet. And we do a really good job of building that kind of work into the program with things like the heavy carries and all the things that we do in the warm-ups and things like that. But it's still something that takes time and practice, and a lot of times intention once we get to knowing that that's the weak link, right?
Yeah.
We got to find it first.
Yeah, you got to figure you don't know.
You got to
know
push.
until you know.
You got to find those limits.
We're actually doing pretty good on time still. I want to talk about this. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk to you about this, and I feel like this idea of like input versus output. And so this is not, we're done with, probably no more fatigue for the rest of the episode. We can circle back to it in the next episode, but if still feel like it's important to talk about, which it is very important to talk about. And this is slightly related to it, so I shouldn't say it's not related to it. But I feel like my life as a person who dabbles in these topics, who has what's that space between like amateur and professional?
Like journeyman?
Yeah, I guess like a journeyman.
I guess it depends on what context. Like this is where I put intermediate, right?
Yeah, like somebody who's I have an intermediate level of like knowledge in these things. It's generally I would consider it to be more than the layman's, but I can't compete with a number of people that I would consider to be key experts. But I feel like my whole world in this is just talking people off the ledge of dumb ideas. And it's just everybody coming to me telling me how excited they are to try this like thing, or they saw this thing, or they're doing this thing. And it's so hard because I need to be respectful of the thing itself, because it's not always a bad thing. But there's just this idea of returns on investment, like effort in versus value out. And it's that idea of where 90% of the work takes 10% of the effort, and 10% of the work takes 90% of the effort, where you get better returns on certain things. And the example that I've seen, I'm gonna loop this up. Everybody thinks I'm rambling right now. It's fine. It's gonna be a full picture in a moment here. So when we talk about something like cleaning like a room or something, and I've heard this example multiple times, And if we imagine that the cleaning the room, this is a metaphor for like your fitness journey, and it's a sty. And so you come in and the first things you do are like pick up all the clothes and all the random loose shit around and the garbage, and then throw the garbage away and put the clothes in the hamper and all this stuff that's like low investment. Doesn't take a whole lot of effort proportionally. And you get a ton of returns back. The room looks way fucking cleaner. Even though it's still dirty, now there's not a whole lot of clutter. It looks like way cleaner. You go like one step further, and then now you're vacuuming. Now you're sweeping. Now you're wiping down the counters. Now that's more effort than just picking up the loose shit, but you're still getting huge returns. It's like an inverse ladder sort of relationship. But then now you're at this point where the room's like 90% clean. You know, you've wiped everything down, you've dusted, you've vacuumed, you've picked up all the clutter, everything's there. But it's like you're chasing 100%. This thing needs to be, I need to be able to like eat off the floor. This place needs to be like a clean room. Then you're starting to look at like what's the next steps, you know, like how do I get in? And then you're going to like the grocery store and you're renting a shampoo vac. And you're coming into your carpets, and now you're just investing like all of this effort above and beyond what's the easiest attainable stuff, and your actual percent returns on how clean that room is getting is marginal. People probably won't even notice, honestly, the difference between like a heavily cleaned room and a heavily cleaned room with shampooed carpets. But you probably would, like a little bit, but it's like not a lot. And that's like fitness with a lot of these things. When we're talking about like marginal returns on things, like people talking about what amino acid differences between products that are two different brands of like whey protein, or should I be taking branched chain amino acids at 8 p.m. or 11 p.m. or like how long after my workout should I get my carb load, or like all these fucking things. That
morning cold shower,
yes, the cold plunge. We talked about this before. It's just like all these things that aren't necessarily like wrong and bad. And a lot of these things do show that there's probably literature out there. There's probably a ton of like just talking to people too, where they get returns from these things, doing these little things. But the peoples that are getting returns on these things are people that are, their room's already mostly fucking clean, you know, like they're coming in and they're at a point. Your room is dirty. You have a dirty room. Like, just pick it up and vacuum. Like, just start there. Rant over. Soapbox away.
I do think that's a lot of good points though, because like, you know, somebody's gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna take this fucking juice every day, and this juice is gonna give me abs, and it's like, well, you know, maybe the juice is fine.
It's not bad juice.
But you gotta figure some other stuff out first before you do the juice. You know, just like if you got pots and pans all over the countertop, cleaning your windows isn't necessarily the first place you should go to clean up your kitchen.
And that's where like this does tie into recovery, where it's like if you're not giving yourself adequate recovery, then cold showers aren't it, dude. If you're not giving yourself enough recovery, then PEDs aren't it, you know? And then we talked about people who are on PEDs don't look like they're on PEDs, and those are those people that don't have the room fucking clean,
yes,
and they're dabbling in, you know, they got a big pile of doo-doo on their carpet, and they went and they bought a carpet shampooer, and now they're just fucking smearing shit into their carpets, and they're like, why isn't it getting clean?
Wow, we really brought the whole episode together. I think that's a good place to end it.
All right. A good soapbox ending.
All right, so this is going into deload week, so everybody have a really good deload week. I hope you're feeling real recovered after this. For those of us on percentages, we're going to be moving into a more concentrated strength phase where reps are going down a little bit, especially on the accessory movements, not so much on the main movements. But now we're not going to be focusing on like tempo or isometrics anymore. It's just going to be more about power output, more high output strength. So a little bit heavier weights, but lower volume overall. take advantage of all the stuff that we did in the beginning. It's the next evolution of the program.
I'm here for it.
With that, see you next time.
See you next time. Like and subscribe. Bye-bye.
Please.
Please.